calendar. We have with us today, are you a native Vermonter?
No, no, I was born in the back of a car.
Ah, well, that wasn't quite the answer I was ready for. Okay, we'll pursue that.
Surprise.
Anyway, our guest is Archer Mayer, whom I know as a resident of Vermont, where I have visited him. And today, we've had a really good time. In fact, we're still catching our breath, aren't we? We have just roared around, giving him kind of a super tour of Phoenix. So, how's it strike you?
Enormous and wonderful, and a place that if I weren't so enamored with Vermont, I would seriously consider moving here with a few other million people. I have to admit, the country boy in me, though, I would have to live on the fringes of this kind of environment. But I love the juxtaposition of major city and yet a major city that looked extraordinarily temporary to me. I mean, I look at the vast countryside all around and I think to myself, just do that and it all goes away. But that's the perversity in my brain at work.
It's not California. In the next rain, we probably won't wash it, down the hillside. I know it is unnerving for people who come here who, see the houses perched on the sides of the mountains, as we did around Camelback and Tatum, and somehow expect it's going to be that whole LA thing, with the next mud down, and we do build on real rock here.
Well, it's true, but in another way, though, it was more the sort of the enormity of the environment here outweighs even the enormity of the humanity, and that's what struck me the most. When I write these books, in fact, I have a big sense of setting in my brain, and that's the first thing I noticed about Phoenix was that the mountains are more impressive than the buildings. The mountains are more permanent. They were there first, they will be there last, and somehow or another they permeate everything, all the vastness around. So no matter how many buildings we put up, no matter how many miles we go out, we're just a heartbeat away from disappearing.
They're a little bit different than your mountains, too. I always think of actually the mountains here as the skeletons of your mountains.
Yes.
They don't have all that soft covering and the trees and so forth.
No.
How long have you lived near Burlington? No, it's not Burlington.
No,
I'm sorry,
Brattleboro.
It's Brattleboro. I
Brattleboro.
always do that,
Yes.
those two Vermont
Opposite
cities.
corner. Yes, if this is Vermont, I'm down here and Burlington's up there.
Well, and I should know that because I've been to visit you there. But,
you have indeed. That restaurant closed, by the way.
Oh, no. Oh, it was so cute. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, you have written your Joe Gunther series, which started out to be a policing series in Brattleboro. Your first book, Open Season, one of my personal treasures. This is one of those collector books that is probably worth now, what do we guess, around $450?
Yeah, thereabouts. Thereabouts, unless you can get it for $14 at a church sale, of course.
Well, there's always, or for a library sale. Nonetheless, this was, I think, published by Putnam in probably a fairly small number, which is one reason it becomes collectible. Written in 1988.
Yes, that's right.
And
or published then, certainly.
Right, well, I'm sorry, written was wrong. You probably worked on it for quite a... How many years did you work on it?
That was the book without the deadline, exactly right. Oh, I would say about 3 years. It was an interesting process because I was in discovery or in search of place and narrative voice and even character. And when I began looking for Joe Gunther, I didn't know that was his name. I didn't know it was a first-person narrator. I didn't know he lived in Brattleboro, Vermont. I didn't even know that he was a police officer. So I wrote Open Season in 3 completely different versions. The first version of which, just to give you some insight, was placed in Julesburg, Virginia, which doesn't exist, and had to do with something about Arabs subverting the U.S. Senate through a terrorist plot, and somehow a character named Joe Gunther not only was in there but got killed off midway through.
No.
So that begat Open Season.
Were you living in Vermont at the time that you wrote it?
Yes, I was.
Why did you set a book in Virginia?
Well, I think you have a lot of times when writers are beginning to discover their comfort zone, they arrive in that spot through a valley of terror and fear. And what the valley of terror and fear means is that you are convinced that as you write, you are exposing yourself to the reading public. They will look at these words that you've typed and they will condemn and judge and draw assumptions about you, the writer, when in fact, if you're worth a damn in this business, you never see the writer, you see the story. And a good writer will give that story entirely over to the reader, and thus the reader will possess it, and it'll be his or her story, and the writer is of no consequence whatsoever. But until you're self-confident enough to understand that process and understand the simple truth that when you were a reader, even as a child, it never crossed your mind to think about the writer behind the words. So you have to sort of turn that corner, come to terms with that understanding, and thus you can write closer. So, Julesburg, Virginia, it wasn't close. Now I write about who I am. It's a first-person narration. It takes place in a state I inhabit, and in fact takes place in a town that's only 12 miles away from my own home.
That's really fascinating. You're a little bit in the Ross McDonald school, aren't you?
Oh, that's quite accurate. He was a formative voice in my growing up.
He very much believed not only that the writer should be, in the position you were describing, but he even liked his detective, Lou Archer, to be largely invisible in the story. There's very little of Lou Archer, the person.
Yeah.
Very different from the character kind of driven novels. And, well, in fact, quite different from the ones that you write, because
That's
one
right.
of the interesting things, not just about Joe, but about the whole cast, is following their personal
Yes.
lives. Why did you decide to write a policing? It's I wouldn't call these a police procedural quite in the same way that maybe an Ed McBain 87th Precinct is, but nonetheless, they are police-centered novels,
are.
and how police work is a critical part of.
Sure.
You go to a lot of trouble, in
Yes, I
fact,
do.
to do all that right. How come you got into that?
A couple of reasons. One is, well, actually, if you really want to go back to the genesis of it all, in 1975, I was underworked. I worked for the state of Texas in those days. I wander a lot, or used to, until I discovered that home is in fact Vermont, which never was in the past. And in Texas, I was basically restricted to quarters because I'd committed that most egregious of errors. When you work for a university press, I made money. Well, you're not supposed to do that. So after I put them on the bestseller list for 6 months, they basically said, you can't leave the building anymore, don't do that again. Do your memos, read your publisher's weekly, and stay out of sight. So about 12 o'clock every day, I began to write novels. So what do you write? You want to express yourself, but you need to find a format in which there is a lot of skeleton early on, because, again, that insecurity comes in. You don't think that you can actually tell a people story without some rigid road to travel. So the rigid road is, of course, the good guy, bad guy, dead guy, car chase road. Now, all skeleton. All I figured, well, okay, you say he said, she said, and a few adjectives here and there, and there's the book. Of course, total folly. And the book was perfectly awful. Absolute exercise in typing. And the first agent I sent it to said exactly that to me, but had the folly to say, in addition, but you have a nice voice, which, of course, was all the encouragement I needed. So I followed that. Was subsequent, I guess, 6, 7, 8, 9 novels, all of them awful, but less and less awful. It was right up there with sitting at a piano and pounding away until somehow or another you could carry a tune. I discovered, I wandered. I'll have to admit, I wrote what might be called an unthrilling thriller, and then I wrote an unlovely love book, and then I wrote this, and I tried this, and I tried that. But sooner or later, I kept going back to the concept of this rigorous world of law and order, of structure, of society, and in fact came to realize that as we look about us, what do we see? We see this all the time. We see it in the headlines, we see it in the newspaper, we see it in the TV set, we travel down the street, we see police officers. The police officers are as much a part of our life as almost everything else or anything else, and yet it's the one element that remains curiously aloof from us and mysterious to us.